So, thanks a lot to be here, both of you. First of all, I would like to thank on my side and on behalf of Pietro and Studio PBL, Philip Baker to be here today with us. It's an honor for us to have the opportunity to speak with Professor Philip Baker in relation to some issues that can arise in this specific emergency moment. So we can try to transform in a new opportunity. So that the opportunity to have a video call to Philip Baker with Philip Baker to understand his feelings in relation to particular tax issues. First of all, we would like to know. Last week, OECD published a new document that is defined like a guidance in relation to the impact of COVID-19 towards the tax treaty rules. So what do you think about this document? Is it enough? Is a good, we would like to understand and to know your opinion about this document.
That's the document.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a very helpful document because it provides some guidance for revenue authorities on the particular issues that may have arise for tax treaties during the current COVID crisis. The main issues that they address arise from the fact that people are unable to travel at the moment. So it may be that some people are stuck in countries where they would not normally be working. Other people are unable to travel. They may be working from home in a different country. And so there are a number of issues that might arise. I should say right at the beginning that tax treaty issues are not the only problems that are going to arise as a result of COVID-19. There are also going to be disruption to supply chains, an impact on transfer pricing arrangements, many problems concerned with the payment of taxes and delaying payment of taxes. Many of those are being addressed by different national tax administrations. And the OECD in the document provides useful guidance. So, for example, where a senior member of the management of a company is stuck at home, maybe in a different country, and they are working from home, is there a danger that the home office from which the individual is working could be regarded as a permanent establishment? And the OECD says, well, no, generally a home office does not give rise to a permanent establishment. It's not at the disposal of the company, so it would not be premises at their disposal through which the business is carried on. So the guidance is extremely helpful. What I think it highlights, though, more generally, are a couple of points. One of them is that the OECD has a very limited mandate in this area. It can provide guidance on the interpretation of tax treaties, and already in that, it's stepping beyond its traditional role of coordinating together different tax authorities, and it's trying to provide a sort of international tax leadership. And when I first saw this, I thought, well, this is the OECD providing international tax leadership. But it does highlight more generally the fact that we need an international tax organization. We have a World Health Organization that's been coordinating efforts with regard to the COVID crisis. In the tax field, the OECD at root is still a membership organization with 30 plus members. Even if you take into account the inclusive framework, it's an inclusive framework for the implementation of BEPS. It's not an international tax organization. And if we want to have coordinated approaches to international tax problems, we need an international tax organization. Now, whether the OECD is the right body, or whether we need a new body formed, or we need actions transferred and activities transferred to the UN, that's a matter that we could debate separately. But what this does show is that on occasions like this, we need international coordination.
Thank you, Philip. I do agree with you. Thank you for the clear view. We need an international organization. I'm absolutely in line with you, and also in this line to having something all in one. Allow me to jump on another important tax international items that we have. Now the economy is under pressure. We know everywhere, in every state, in every country. On the one side, you have lots of companies suffering a lot. On the other side, you have other companies which are really of help on the one side of the activities which can rise gains and profits in this period, working through directly or indirectly through the web. So the item is the web tax. So we will very glad to have also your input on this web tax. It's time to push, it's time to slow down. What do you think about it?
Well, what's interesting about any crisis like this is that there are, in a sense, businesses that are winners and losers. There are many businesses that have had to shut down, that have absolutely no turnover at the present moment, and at the end of the day, those businesses may not survive the crisis. And coming on top of an anticipated economic recession that was probably going to come in any event, the crisis will have significantly deepened that recession, and we may well have businesses that simply don't survive COVID-19. On the other hand, there are certain areas where the businesses are actually thriving. Businesses that are involved in delivering goods to people's homes, the supplies of food and necessities, medical supplies, supplies of computerized communication systems, the people who supply the software for this video conference. They probably had more sales in the last couple of weeks than they have had in years previously. My own chambers, we've had video conferencing for some time. We've suddenly had our license fee by a different supplier very greatly increased because there's a significant increase in the demand for it. So there are going to be some companies that make excess profit out of this. Very often when you've had something like a war or a crisis that has led to some businesses making excess profit, it will not be surprising if governments, after the crisis is over, look to introduce excess profit taxes to cream away some of those profits that have been made by those companies in these circumstances, to pay for the huge social and economic cost that has been caused. The cost of providing medical care has been huge in many countries, and it will become larger and larger over the next couple of weeks, and governments will want to recoup that. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see excess profits tax arising. On the specific question of digital service taxes, such as being enacted in Italy and that was brought into effect in the United Kingdom in principle just a couple of days ago, those were intended to be interim measures pending an international solution, which is being discussed at the OECD. And of course, the OECD is still trying to reach international consensus on a new method of taxing the digital economy. In some senses, the COVID crisis has made reaching solutions more critical, more urgent, but also far less likely that there will be a solution this year. The OECD had aimed for a target date of the end of this year. I think many people thought that that was unrealistic in any event. And even though they are trying to continue discussions during the crisis, clearly this is not what governments have their focus on at the present moment, and they are likely to lose several months of potential discussion and work towards a solution. That may not be a bad thing. This is not a good year for getting international agreement on a new system of taxing the digital economy. It's an election year in the US. Governments are going to be facing the difficulties caused by the crisis, the recession that follows, and it may be a better thing to wait until next year to try to find an international solution once we know who is going to be the American president, whether the COVID crisis is no doubt going to have an impact on the American elections. The Americans are going to see their government in a new light, potentially. We may have a different president next year. That president may have a very different view about international cooperation. Coming back more specifically, one thing that COVID has highlighted is how different service providers over the internet are going to be impacted to a different degree by the COVID crisis. For example, those providing travel services, Uber, Airbnb, those sorts of companies, they must have suffered very, very heavily, and will quite rightly say, imposing a tax on us at a time when we're actually making no profit and probably losses is very harsh indeed. On the other hand, there will be some internet service providers that are seeing a huge spike in their usage and are making very large profits. And they may be saying, well, actually, a flat rate tax on turnover, our turnover has gone up, but it's not going to remain constantly at that sort of level for the time. So perhaps what it's taught us is if you are going to have a tax on turnover, you have to be aware of the very different economic circumstances of different businesses, not just the economic cycle, but also shocks to the system, which result in some being very much less profitable at periods than others.
To agree with this situation and this overview, because at the beginning of this year, where we were talking about the OECD Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, nobody could imagine about this situation. So this situation can change everything now, as you are saying, for sure.
Well, one thing that I think it may very well change, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 were very, very modest proposals. Quite frankly, the calculations of the amount that it actually yielded in tax, particularly for developing countries, was very little indeed. And at the moment, one of the strange positions we're in at the present moment is that COVID-19 has hit the more developed world quite heavily, countries like Italy, countries like the UK, because we have people who are traveling to these countries. I think all of us are holding our breath and looking with potential horror at what might happen when COVID-19 starts to reach in large numbers the less developed world that doesn't have the medical facilities that Italy, the UK, the US has, and how bad the results may very well be. And I've no doubt that the populations in those countries are going to demand far better medical care going forward. And frankly, it is appalling that we're sitting here thinking what is going to be the situation when COVID-19 hits some of those countries that really have underdeveloped medical systems. BEPS and the whole pillar 1, pillar 2, global, whatever, they do very little for those countries. Those countries are going to have to try to cope with the medical facilities they have now, and ask for more funds for the future. And I realistically, what this shows is how the BEPS project has been concerned with shifting tax receipts amongst the more developed world, but has done virtually nothing for the less developed countries.
Yeah, we have a changement to take into consideration, maybe rethinking, and I'm going back to your idea. I do agree with you that we need a common organization, an international tax organization, to take care about every single items, and maybe the new world that we will have in the future after this difficult, very bad period.
Yeah, but that new world has to have a much greater representation and involvement from the developing countries and not from the OECD member countries. The days when the OECD countries dominated international tax must be over. We have to recognize that there are many countries in the world that simply don't have the financial resources to put in place the sort of medical arrangements that can deal with crises like this. I mean, if you go back 100 years to the Spanish flu epidemic, and I've been reading a little bit about it, and in some senses it's astonishing that we didn't learn the lessons from 100 years ago there. But it was when the Spanish flu was carried by soldiers from Europe returning to India and Africa that the flu spread in huge numbers in places like Southern Africa, India, and the large number of deaths arose in those parts of the world where social distancing just isn't possible, and where it's just not feasible to say to people, quarantine yourselves for 3 months. You will just have to make do on whatever supplies you have. And countries just are not set up for those things. And if we cannot be assured that we won't have viruses like this, we need to have in all countries the medical facilities to deal with these. I mean, in a sense, if you think about China, as you may know, one of my interests is Chinese studies. I started in the world of academia in sinology rather than in tax. When I first visited China in the 1980s, China was in no way in the position that it has been this year to deal with COVID-19. It's the huge economic success that China has made of the last 40 years that's put China in a position where it could deal with the crisis, perhaps not as rapidly as it should have done, but managed to restrain it in the country. But many other parts of the world are not going to be in a position to deal with it, even in the way that Italy and Spain and the UK are dealing with it.
So by these two questions, the first one about the paper. So we started the beginning from the paper to arrive, thanks to Pietro question, to arrive maybe to the fact that following this crisis, emergency crisis, probably the OECD will become less powerful, probably. What do you think?
That's a possibility there. I think unless the OECD fundamentally changes and starts to recognize really the interests of the non-OECD member countries. It's almost impossible to imagine that happening, because at the end of the day, we've had the inclusive framework for what, 3-4 years. Academics like you and me and others are kept out from these meetings, but from what we hear to an extent, they are still dominated by the OECD member countries. These countries are still in a dominant position in international taxation. The only real organization that fully represents all the countries in the world is the United Nations. Now, the current United Nations Committee on Taxation is not in a position to take on a leading role. It has a very limited mandate and is hugely, hugely under-resourced. And the OECD has been growing in resources in the last couple of years, but maybe one thing that will come out of this is a feeling that there has to be a true international tax organization. The resources currently committed to the OECD will transfer to that organization, and that organization will take on the sort of responsibility for leading what's going to be. Let's just step back a second. We are on the edge of an economic crisis of the same sort of magnitude as in 2008, if not back to the depression of the 1930s. Tax is going to play a very important role in funding the reconstruction of the world economies, and it has to be done on a much fairer basis, a much more equal basis, but one that recognizes the much greater needs of certain parts of the world, so that they're ready when next time there is the next virus, when it's COVID-30 or COVID-40 or whatever comes along. Those countries have the resources to deal with it.
We really bother Philip for an interesting exchange of thoughts. Thank you very much, Philip. Really appreciate.
You're welcome.
I think that, yeah, that's a good start for other moments of thoughts with together with other professor of international tax law.
Thank you very much, and we hope to have the same opportunity in the future. Thank you, and
Take care and be safe.